Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora across APAC. We're delighted to be joined today by Naoaki Eguchi. He is a partner at Baker McKenzie and co-head of the firm's Renewable and Clean Energy Group in Tokyo. Nick focuses his practice on project finance and renewable energy, solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, and hydroelectric. He's worked on a lot of the major transactions that have occurred in Japan, as well as authoring academic articles, most recently as a co-author of the Offshore Wind Finance Guidebook. Nick, welcome to Energy Unplugged today.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're also joined today by Hayato Ono, Aurora's head of advisory in Japan. Hayato, thanks for being here too.
Thanks for having me.
Nick, let's dive right in then. So for those listeners who aren't based in Japan, it is important context that Japan's electricity market is changing rapidly. We're going to step through some of these changes, and I know that's kind of a big question to describe what's going on, so we might break it down into a few categories. If we could start with market design and policy. Again, a huge amount happening here. Most notably, the change from feed-in tariffs to premiums, low carbon 20-year auctions or subsidies, and the introduction of carbon pricing potentially over time. Can you just give our audience a high-level sense of those big major changes that are sweeping Japan's electricity system?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good intro. I think we are in the middle of a big change. Go back to 2012, we started feed-in tariff. The solar power tariff was 40 yen. It was very high tariff, which attracted Japanese and overseas investors. And we have more than 10 years passed. And we have more than 70 gigawatt solar in operation in Japan. It's amazing volume in the last 10 years. But because of the high tariff driver to solicit investment from Japanese investors and overseas investors. And overseas investors and Japanese investors, especially for early investors, made a huge profit. So I saw a very happy investors' faces during the sales of the secondary sales transactions. But we are in the middle of the carbon zero target by 2050. And the Japanese government, the 2030 target is a double of the solar power and 5 times more of the wind power. Wind power currently is only about 6 gigawatt, but we need to make it 5 times more by 2030. That is a government very high target to meet the carbon neutral by 2050. So we are middle of the transforming to a carbon neutral society.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on that generation mix there. I think the rise of renewables are probably the biggest part of that story. But again, just for our listeners who aren't in Japan, Japan has obviously thermal resources, but the Fukushima shock was enormous as well. So a big nuclear fleet essentially shut down overnight and in the process of restarting. Aside from the very aggressive renewable growth targets. Could you just give a bit of context for our listeners as to what's happening to the other types of assets on the Japanese system?
Sure. The nuclear has restarted some of the plants, but the Japanese people are very cautious about the nuclear. So the process is very slow and very time-consuming process to check the security and reliabilities, and so it will take certain time for restart of the nuclear power. And of course, other resources, the biomass and small hydro and geothermals also very important, the generation type, especially for geothermals. We have huge resources of geothermals in Japan, but because of the national park restriction, it's not easy to develop the geothermals in a large scale. So government is gradually deregulating the restriction, but the speed is unfortunately very slow.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about the 20-year long-term decarbonization, the support, which will start next year, probably in January, and the registration will start this autumn. At the moment, government is checking the public comment collected this August, and probably in September, we will have a result of the public comment on the draft of the auction system. So we will have a clear picture in September, and the registration will start in September or October, and actual auction submission will be in early 2024. The renewable power and the transition coal-fire power and also batteries are eligible for the long-term decarbonization facilities.
Yeah, and we'll certainly touch on batteries in a little bit. I know Hayato's got a couple of questions there. I mean, you talked there about both domestic Japanese players and overseas players taking advantage of some fairly generous feed-in tariffs. The Japanese kind of vertically integrated utilities are still playing an enormous role in the market, obviously, but have been buffeted, I think it's safe to say, by some of the changes to the market, introducing increased competition, and also some of the wholesale market volatility we've seen. Could you just describe like how the players are changing in the market? I presume, like us, you're working with as many Western renewable developers as you are big domestic Japanese utilities and developers.
Yes, Japanese big utilities, electricity and gas power are also jumping in the renewable market, and they are developing their own renewable generation resources. And because we started at the 40 yen feed-in tariff, the burden for each users of electricity is getting higher. I pay myself $10 per month to support the feed-in tariff system.
Yeah.
And the surcharge is getting higher and higher. So that's why Japanese government are shifting from feed-in tariff to a feed-in premium system to implement the market-driven the support mechanism. And the feed-in premium situation, the generation company sell the power to the market, which is fluctuating 30 minutes by 30 minutes, but the premium support is provided to have the stable or cash flow. But it is market driven. So if the market price is low, then the generation company may store the power in a battery and sell it at a higher price period. So that is the government the initiation to change from feed-in tariff to feed-in premium system. It's ongoing at the moment, and some of the feed-in tariff players apply to the change to the feed-in premium situation. So we are helping their change.
Yeah, and I mean, some of our overseas listeners, I think, and I'm no expert on some of these European markets, but Spain and others have seen similar transitions from very generous feed-in tariffs to other systems and the erosion of some of those rents as a result. So we've talked a little bit about market design and policy, the generation mix, and then the types of players in the market. I think the other thing that's probably worth flagging up front to people who aren't experts in the Japanese market is just some of the big long-term bets from the Japanese government, both to ensure security of supply and to decarbonize. And we'll get to some of the challenges in Japan, but it genuinely has very real physical constraints, relatively less land, quite steep coastline, which makes fixed bottom offshore wind harder. It has to import all its gas and coal. It had to close down its nuclear fleet basically all at once. So very real challenges, and energy security is front of mind as a kind of policy issue for all Japanese governments. And so correspondingly, they are making some big bets. In my mind, it's particularly offshore wind and some aggressive targets there, hydrogen and ammonia. And I think, we can get to that, but also transmission build out. So trying to get better levels of interconnection between the 9 or 10 regions. Could you just talk a little bit about those long-term bets and your thoughts, and maybe starting with offshore wind, because I know that's one of your areas of expertise.
Sure. Yeah. As you correctly pointed out, energy security is a very big issue after the Ukraine invasion. So it's a very serious issue for Japan. We are depending on import of the fossil fuel energy. So we need to transform to energy independent society. So that is a government, the big driver to promote the offshore wind in Japan. And we have a round one auction closed, and Mitsubishi Corporation obtained all three the zones, which was about 1.7 gigawatt. And round two auction was closed this July, and we will have the result in December, or if the overlap happens, then March, maybe the result will come up. So clients are waiting for outcome of the round two auction. But the government target is an annual auction for offshore wind. So round three auction will start this autumn. So it's an annual event for every year. And the government target for offshore wind is 10 gigawatt by 2030, and 30 to 45 gigawatt by 2040. So it's a huge target for a Japanese government to meet the energy independence in the long run.
And the team's deeper than I'm on this, but my understanding is at least a decent portion of that will have to be floating as well, because there just aren't necessarily sufficient sites with the right transmission configurations to make that all fixed bottom. And those are very aggressive targets as well.
Sure. Yes, you're right. The Japanese sea is different from North Sea in Europe. And we have a steep decline of the seabed. So the floating offshore is very important. And the government is currently discussing about the EEZ, the new legislation. At the moment, current offshore wind auction within Japanese territory, which is 12 nautical miles, which is 22 kilometers from the coastline. But if we have EEZ, exclusive economic zone territory, then we can have the huge amount of the floating ocean wind zones outside of the territorial area. So hopefully the next diet in January, they may discuss the new legislation of EEZ, the leasing arrangement.
Terrific. And then the other one, and feel free to say if it's not front of mind for your thinking at the moment, but Octo has put out reasonably aggressive plans to augment transmission. Japanese market.
Right.
Japan has, I think, a lot of the same issues as all markets in that it's challenging to build transmission for supply chain, social license, and other issues. I mean, I suppose you optimistic that Octo's those plans will be delivered on time, or do you see challenges there?
Yes, thank you. It's a very important point because we have a lot of solar in operation. So curtailment has started in Kyushu area, and it's already spread to the other areas, except for a typical area, Tokyo area. So the grid improvement is very important, and the government now plan to have a direct current, high voltage direct current from Hokkaido to Tokyo by 2030. This is the Prime Minister's direction to achieve this implementation. Of course, it takes time, but it's already, we have cost analysis, and fundamental planning will start soon to meet the Prime Minister's direction. So if it is developed, the direct current high voltage line from Hokkaido to Kanto area, it will improve a lot. Because in the Hokkaido area, lots of suitable offshore wind area in Hokkaido, and Hokkaido can be a battery of Japan for in the long run.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, like a lot of markets, and again, for our listeners who maybe aren't so familiar with Japanese geography, Kyushu is the furthest system south, and Hokkaido is the furthest system north, and the kind of relative ends of the archipelago, and are the areas that are both seeing and likely to see moving forward curtailment from excess renewables if the grid's not reinforced. So, very similar to markets like Australia, where it's the ends of Australia that saw negative pricing or curtailment earliest. And hopefully that helps make the economic case for additional transmission. And as I said, the plan apparently under the Octo guidelines is to have additional reinforced lines by 2028. But again, as we said, I'm sure Japan's seeing the same challenges in transmission build out as a lot of other markets.
Yeah. So especially undersea cable, technical wise, it's possible, but we have a lot of discussion. We need to have a discussion with a stakeholder like the fishermen. So it takes time, but it's a prime minister's pledge. So we hope it will happen as planned. And in the meantime, I think a battery can help the stability of the grid situation. At the moment, the massive battery projects are coming into Japanese market. And in the Hokkaido area, about 2.5 gigawatt application has already made. And the Kyushu area also 2.4 gigawatt application is made. And we are actually helping clients, for example, 50 megawatt battery in Hokkaido area. And the Ministry of Trade and Economy provide the subsidy to Ministry of Economy and Trade provide a subsidy to battery players up to 20. It's about 20 million US dollar subsidy for the battery players, and also long-term decarbonization. The support will also cover the standalone, the grid side battery projects. So we expect the huge investment in battery space while constructing the grid line by 2030. And also lots of overseas batteries players coming to Japan, so which is very helpful because they have experience and the transaction in overseas, and they are implementing their know-how into a Japanese market, which is very good to have a stabilizing the Japanese grid system.
Thank you, Nick, for touching on offshore wind development and also battery build-out. Actually, Aurora has been doing quite a lot of work on the economics of batteries in Japan and overseas. And I know that you guys have been working on utility scale battery projects. We're actually relatively bullish on battery build-out in Japan. So for 2035, our forecast is roughly around 13 gigawatt capacity. This would be driven by what you touched on, the METI subsidies through the long-term decarbonization auctions. Also, capacity to market payments, opportunities in wholesale, and also the upcoming balancing markets. So may I ask, do you also feel similarly bullish on batteries in Japan?
Sure. I think battery is very important, and luckily the battery price is coming down, and it's becoming economical to have a battery in place. And the Japanese government are deregulating the battery regulation. And now the 10 megawatt or more battery is regarded as a power station. And it's in have a situation, the place in the legal system, and some of the regulation of the fire regulation, and so that the battery can be installed easily. So and also the solar power plus battery or the wind power plus battery also coming in the market. So in a feed-in premium situation, it makes sense to have a battery aside to the solar power or wind power station to maximize is price of the market price.
So actually, we touched on batteries as well as offshore wind, but in general, for renewable deployment in Japan, what would you say are the biggest roadblocks, right? So a couple of the, I think we also touched on the grid upgrades or lack thereof, government support, supply chain issues. Japan does have land constraints, and also recently we've seen a lot of local opposition. For example, in Tohoku, there's been a new tax proposal against onshore wind. So what would you say are roadblocks in Japan for renewables?
Yeah, the most important things is a local acceptance. Unfortunately, some miscommunication happened, and the local people opposed to the solar power and wind power development. So we advise to the clients to have early communication with local stakeholders to explain and take into account their concern for development of the wind power and solar power projects. I'm thinking about some win-win structure, such as some investment through a non-voting shares or the silent partner investment by local stakeholders without voting system. I mean, if the generation, if you have a higher generation, then local people may get some return from the project, which is already implemented in Denmark and Germany. So I'm wondering why the investor think about the new structure for some return to local stakeholders. Unfortunately, there are some bad players in a small scale solar projects. They are destroying the market, and unfortunately, they are losing the trust by the local community. So I think METI are now monitoring on the bad players and canceling their the ID. So that is also important to have the certain monitoring by the authority to have the better performance by the developers.
Yes, I mean, Japan has seen quite a lot of roadblocks and challenges, but so far I've been impressed by how much renewable has been deployed in Japan, and I'm quite bullish, in going forward in terms of not just renewables but also batteries. I do want to touch on hydrogen, ammonia as well. So the Japanese government does have quite a comprehensive strategy on hydrogen and ammonia. So I just wanted to ask you, like, how do you feel about the government strategy in place today? I believe they have a great focus on green hydrogen ammonia being imported from around the world. So just would like to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. The Japanese energy mix is 1% by 2030, hydrogen and ammonia, which is, I think it's a bit low target. I hope it will be much more. But the energy mix will be revised next year. So we will see the new energy mix target, taking into account the current situation after the Ukraine situation. So I hope the much higher target of the hydrogen and ammonia in the next energy mix plan. And it's true. It's the price is higher in a green ammonia and green hydrogen and ammonia in Japan. So the current plan is to have the green hydrogen or green ammonia in Australia or other places and import those into Japan. But I think in the long run, if we have the Hokkaido North Island floating offshore projects, then we can produce green hydrogen and green ammonia within Japan. So that will be the long-term goal, I think.
Nick, that's what I was about to say, because I think the hydrogen story in Japan is going to be at least part driven by economics, obviously, and cost reductions. But my understanding at the top levels of Japanese policy making is that the focus will be on diversity, some domestic production, whether that's in Hokkaido or other parts of the country, and then a diversified set of international suppliers to avoid the dynamic that's played out in gas markets where the Japan economy is, dependent on relatively few suppliers and buffeted by kind of pretty extreme cost volatility. Is that a fair summation, do you think, of the overarching kind of geopolitics and policy of this?
Yes, yeah, the diversifying the resources is very important to have security. And so, of course, in initial stage, I think that cost-wise, the importing from green hydrogen and ammonia from overseas, from friendly countries, is ideal scenario. And I think the Japanese government are helping, subsidizing that initiatives. And actually, the shipping from Australia to Japan on the green hydrogen is tested, and the next phase is scaling up the size of the hydrogen, and it's a chicken and egg issue. But of course, we need to increase the use of the hydrogen in a Japanese market, and especially in the steel or cement or that heavy fossil fuel users need to transform from the fossil fuel to hydrogen, and that is also the Green Innovation Fund support for the Japanese government.
So hydrogen ammonia space, it seems there are a lot of exciting things happening here, and also the new strategic energy plan, hopefully coming out next year. I think that will be quite interesting from not just hydrogen ammonia perspective, but also renewables in general. Just one more thing from my side. Just in Japan, what would you say are business models you see as being particularly successful? And also on the flip side, recently we have seen a number of bankruptcies, consolidation of smaller new retailers. So do you think that business model of deregulating the power market in Japan for end users, has that been maybe perhaps net negative for consumers?
Yeah, still in the middle of the change, and unfortunately, because of the LNG volatile price situation, we had the F-Power bankruptcy. It was a surprise and unfortunate event. So stabilizing the power market is very important. And the volume of the transaction must be increased, and the power market expansion and the stabilization is a very important agenda for Japan.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's always hard to judge the success or otherwise of these big privatization, deregulation exercises, because it's very hard to identify the counterfactual, but also there's so many things happening simultaneously that where does the blame lie? But it certainly seems like it's been a tough couple of years for the big Japanese utilities. At the same time, they have big retail books and they're relatively well placed moving forward, arguably to build out big green portfolios. So I think the dynamics in Japan will be particularly interesting.
Yeah, it's a try and error exercise.
Yeah.
And it's important to try and fix it if it is it doesn't work. So it's a very interesting. Japan used to be a very conservative country, but now it's changing and testing new stuff. And overseas players help us a lot about implementing overseas know-how into the Japanese power market. We see a lot of market players coming into Japan to have the battery operation or market buy and sell know-how. It's very interesting period.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the big sophisticated European renewable developers seem to be entering Japan, the Ørsteds, the Iberdrolas, BayWas, etc. But also the smaller battery developers, the Acacias, the Amps, and a couple of others like that. So it is a really interesting and increasingly diverse set of players on the generation side. Nick, you've been extremely generous with your time. So perhaps one last question from the Aurora side. Who do you read to or listen to in the Japanese energy space that is always good and thought-provoking and relevant to your work in the private sector? Is there anyone that springs to mind?
Oh, sure. There are several industry organizations in a renewable space, like Japan Wind Power Associations and Renewable Energy Association for Sustainable Power Supply, which is very long name. So we call it RIASP. Those industry association is a source of the information. So if you join those industry association, you can gather lots of important and up-to-date information. And especially, I would recommend the Mr. Kato of the energy supply planning, which is Mr. Kato is an ex-TEPCO guy, and he is well-known figure in the energy market. So he has every 2 months presentation at the RIASP gathering, and which the last Monday was we had his presentation, so we can catch up-to-date information from Mr. Kato's presentation. It's called Energy System Planning, ESP.
ESP. That's a great list. And there's certainly more, it seems, attention in the academic community on Japan as well. I know the Berkeley group just put out a good paper on forecasting Japan's energy mix. We wrote a research note comparing our analysis to there, and I think there are some interesting points of difference and similarities. So yeah, more academic work in this space as well.
Academic is very important to have the basis for a change. Yeah.
Nick, you've been extremely generous with your time. I know how busy you are as a real nexus in the Japanese energy market. Thank you enormously, and we look forward to speaking soon.
Sure. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and we welcome the overseas investors into the Japanese exciting energy market. Thank you.
And overseas market modelers as well, I hope. Hayato, thanks for your time too.
Thank you.
That was Hugo Batten, Aurora's Managing Director for APAC, talking to Naoaki Eguchi, partner at Baker McKenzie and co-head of the firm's Renewable and Clean Energy Group in Tokyo, and Hayato Ono, Aurora's head of advisory in Japan. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.